The auteur behind possibly the first ever Eastern European computer role-playing game, the inaugural Slavjank, dedicated 20 years of his life to accumulating esoteric knowledge of ancient Aryans, along with the enigmatic teachings of Kabbalah and the secrets of tarot. His ultimate goal is to make a strategy RPG, to create a training machine for the mind. Chapter 1: King's Bounty and its consequences. Kharkiv, the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, the 80s. Serhiy Prokofiev made his first game on an Electronica MK52, a Soviet-manufactured programmable calculator. It was a simple logic game where you had to guess a number, and it involved two players. He got into coding by randomly picking a book on mathematical programming at a bookstore. At first, it was just a way of passing the time, and then he got a job at a university laboratory. Prokofiev knew nothing about photoelectron spectroscopy, but he did know how to translate mathematical algorithms into program code, and that was enough to be useful. This is how he got access to a real computer. The year was 1988. Video games were rapidly proliferating in the university environment. Some of the first Soviet gamers were academics. Prokofiev spent sleepless nights playing at the lab. One game in particular stood out. In 1990, New World Computing published King's Bounty, a fantasy video game by John Van Caneghem, an American video game designer of some renown, who was involved in the creation of Might and Magic series of role-playing games. In the 80s and the early 90s, the Might and Magics, as well as Wizardries and Ultimas, dominated the scene, just like the Elder Scrolls and the Fallout games do now. Admittedly, the absolute size of the market was much smaller back then. King's Bounty is a turn-based strategy game with light RPG elements. There are 4 character classes to choose from: Barbarian, Knight, Paladin, and Sorceress. Each class has different starting troops, leadership skill, and spell power. This is what the character sheet looks like. It's not much. After hiring basic troops, the player goes exploring around the randomly generated map, collecting treasure chests and battling wandering armies, with combat taking place on a separate screen. The graphics were fine for the time, the game's system requirements were reasonable. King's Bounty ran on the ES series of IBM PC-compatible Soviet computers, manufactured in the Belarusian SR, Bulgaria, and in the Robotron factory in East Germany. Fielding up to 5 different units, the player starts with a basic human army, but eventually will be able to recruit all sorts of creatures. The mechanical and visual variety of the units is one of the game's strengths. The sprites are fast skirmishers. The weird guys in red robes are this game's gnomes. Ghosts grow in number as they kill. Our goal in the game is to collect the pieces of the map that will point us to the location of the lost Scepter of Order. There is a time limit, but on the lower difficulties it's fairly generous. Prokofiev finished King's Bounty 2 many dozens of times. He wanted to play even more, but there was no more game. This is how he arrived at the idea of making a sequel, and naturally, the project would be called King's Bounty 2. December 26, 1991. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. The Ukrainian SR becomes Ukraine. Sustained by a diet of tea and bread, Prokofiev and his colleague Andrei Salo spent countless hours working on what would eventually become the first proto-RPG to emerge from this part of the world. In 1993, they make the version 1.0 and publish it online. The graphics are... well, this is programmer art. Personally, I prefer the warm color palette of the original game, but the sequel is not without its merits. The units are beautifully detailed, and the selection is interesting. This is Alexei, creature from Slavic mythology. The guy in red pants with a scimitar is a dwarf, the strangest dwarf I've ever seen. The unit with a spear is called a native. The core gameplay loop is the same. We explore the continent, collect treasure chests, recruit and fight monsters. The math behind the combat is a mystery to me. I lost every battle until I managed to recruit elven archers, who seem to be one-shotting or halving enemy stacks of any size. And then I won every battle. The currency in King's Bounty 2 is the United States dollar. Makes sense, it might have as well been fictional. The game now has wandering characters, a wizard and a dark sorcerer. There are two of them on every continent. A wizard is a good guy who can improve your spell power attribute, but a dark sorcerer is a menace. His job is to ruin your game. If he does catch you, expect unpleasantries. An interesting late-game addition is the ability to fuse different units into a single entity. Imagine a peasant with attributes of a dragon. In order to begin the experiments, we need to have more than 10 points in spell power, collect 4 special artifacts, and consult the speaking stones. The process is elaborate. The creations of occult genetic engineering are called Murlants. The goal of the game has changed. The player no longer seeks a buried artifact. Instead, we need to reach the Dark Castle, located on the Lost Continent. The 6th continent, called Malgrimia, was supposed to be the ultimate challenge, featuring Prokofiev's most unusual ideas. It was never implemented. King's Bounty 2 enthusiasts theorized that the Lost Continent had to be explored within a single in-game day, and that the player had to learn advanced spells to stop the flow of time. In the KB2 README file, Prokofiev lists the names of the original King's Bounty developers. I want to say thank you, but my words will not be heard. Prokofiev never thought of King's Bounty 2 as a real video game. It was his hobby project, a toy. So when a friend told him that the game is being distributed illegally by computer pirates, he just straight up didn't believe it. Not until he began receiving emails from players who seemed to have enjoyed his creation. Based on King's Bounty, there is a spelling error on the information screen. You didn't need to understand English to play the original. On the same info screen, we learned that Andrei Salo's nickname was Grandpa. It also has the dev's address and phone number. It appears it's this house over here, a place of power. The README file has a section called Regrets. I want to comment on the insufficient, in my opinion, entertainment value of this version of the game, due to the lack of proper sound accompaniment and the immobility of the characters. Since I'm a programmer by trade, I paid more attention to the game algorithm, to the detriment of the visuals. But over time, I hope to smooth out these shortcomings. And indeed, the story of Prokofiev doesn't end here. But before we go on, we should check on what the Americans are up to. In 1995, half a decade after the original King's Bounty, John Van Caneghem and New World Computing would revisit its mechanics in Heroes of Might and Magic. Some things changed, some things stayed the same. In addition to exploration and turn-based combat, there is now a castle management aspect. You have to collect resources, construct buildings, and manage an economy. The game now has 4 different factions, or castles, to choose from. With its bright, expressive visuals, modest system requirements, reasonably deep but easy-to-learn mechanics, Heroes of Might and Magic was a fantastic game to grow up with, but it gets better. In 1996, following the success of the first Might and Magic, New World Computing released a sequel. Now we have a non-linear campaign with a story that ties into the plot of the cult first-person RPG Might and Magic 6: The Mandate of Heaven. The castle management layer is more complex, with more things to build, more choices to make. 2 new armies were added, the Wizards and the Necromancers with mummy shock troops. The Heroes series inherited the treasure hunting element of King's Bounty, although in most missions finding the treasure is not a win condition. In addition to basic stats, heroes now have skills like mysticism that improves mana capacity, or leadership that improves troop morale. It's a great sequel. Some contrarians say this is the best Heroes game, but they are wrong. It gets even better. In the year 1999, Heroes of Might and Magic 3 completed the system of Van Canaham. Now we have multiple campaigns with persistent heroes migrating from mission to mission. The pre-rendered cinematics now feature characters with even less clothing. The visual artists made a cautious step towards realism. The game no longer looks like a cartoon. Some maps now have an underground lair, and there is a new faction of dungeon lords, fielding armies of beholders and harpies. The inventory is no longer a primitive list. You have to equip items in appropriate slots. The game has a vast library of expansions, campaigns, and player-created content. It wouldn't be controversial to call Heroes 3 one of the best strategy games ever made. Unfortunately for him, at the time, Serhiy Prokofiev didn't have a computer capable of running it. His friends let him borrow theirs for the night, and he had to return it in the morning. He was looking for a job. Many people were. In 2002, during a period of financial instability, many developers from New World Computing were let go. A smaller group of essential staff stayed on, but the financial troubles hadn't improved. Heroes of Might and Magic 4, released the same year, ended up being their last game. And it was good. They never made a bad one. The most dramatic innovation is that the heroes are now battlefield units. They can now attack and be attacked. It's possible to field armies with multiple heroes or with no heroes. The battlefield hex grid was changed to square grid, making it easier to have units of different sizes. The game featured a fixed-view isometric camera. The biggest problem with Heroes 4 was that the previous installment was simply too good. New World Computing is a strong company with a notable legacy. They managed to do more for the turn-based strategy genre than anyone else. It's not surprising that with their departure, this genre of games began to be considered unprofitable. Strong and creative personalities may well determine the level of the genre, as well as its profitability. In 2002, Prokofiev, assisted by two unpaid enthusiasts, was once again working on a video game project. You are about to see possibly the most Eastern European thing ever. This is a website of Alpha Class LLC, a company that sells laboratory equipment and furniture. The director of the company is Prokofiev Serhiy Valentinovich. Looks like he got back into the photoelectron spectroscopy game. The website has a philosophy page. A man is a world in miniature. That's a quote from Rabbi Nathan, the chief rabbi of Krakow, Poland, a Jewish mystic and a Kabbalist. That's not even the strangest thing about this website. If we navigate to About Us section and then to this subsection, we discover what appears to be a strategy RPG franchise hiding between the pages. Perhaps the sixth continent is not lost to us after all. In 2005, Prokofiev and his team finished work on Malgrimia, a Heroes of Might and Magic type of experience named after the unimplemented final continent from King's Bounty 2. The publisher insisted on renaming it to Heroes of Malgrimia, a sensible decision, as it doesn't seem that the game had much of a marketing budget. Malgrimia was never translated to foreign languages, and even among Russophonic strategy gaming enthusiasts, there is little awareness of its existence. To address the elephant in the room, for a mid-2000s release, the visuals are not good, and the art direction is atrocious. It's hard to tell interactive objects from scenery. Things don't get better on the battle screen, which is now scrollable. If you have two groups of mobs standing next to each other, attacking one will get the other dragged into the battle. You can have a three-way. Despite the obvious superficial similarities, this is not a Heroes of Might and Magic clone. The town management mechanics are completely different. For starters, towns must be built by a hero. You can construct a town almost anywhere in the game world. Additionally, you can enter towns and even go inside individual buildings. Unfortunately, unit diversity is lacking in Malgrimia. The player's army is basically just a few types of dudes in different colored shirts. Some dudes ride horses, and there are mythical creatures like griffins and manticores, but they all look quite similar. Malgrimia was criticized for having a convoluted and over-designed user interface, with many switches and lists that have no obvious functionality. There is no campaign or a story story. There are pre-made scenarios and a random map generator. The biome names are borrowed from King's Bounty 2. Picking Saharia means the generator will create a desert map, which is a little easier on the eyes. Prokofiev acknowledged that the team was inexperienced when it came to large projects, and the game didn't turn out as they expected it would. 15 individuals worked on Heroes of Malgrimia, and the game paid for itself in less than a month. The budget for this must have been tea and bread. Heroes of Malgrimia 2, Invasion of the Necromancer, was out in February 2007. The nations of skeletons, ghosts and zombies are doing everything to ensure that an unquenchable black sun rises over the universe of heroes. This game is not an attempt to make money, but rather to express the knowledge I've been gathering for 20 years, explains Prokofiev in a presentation recorded by the LKI magazine, who misidentified Malgrimia as a Russian project. Just like our body needs exercise, our mind also requires training. This game is a training machine. He says that every major civilization has its own set of mysterious practices, and ultimately it's the enlightened, the practitioners of the occult, who determine the psychology of a nation. The game is infused with mystical knowledge, from the ancient Aryans to the wisdom of tarot cards, with a bunch of stuff in between. So a physicist by training, a programmer by trade, and a sorcerer by vocation. Speaking of the secrets of the ancients, I wasn't able to make Malgrimia 2 run on my machine because of the old copy protection system. But it doesn't matter. The standalone expansion Defeat a Dragon, released in 2009, is essentially the same game with a number of quality of life fixes, a map editor, and a story campaign. The sun generously scattered its rays onto the blanket of snow, covering the rocks of the Unicorn's land. Captain Rosenkraytsev stood at the peak, admiring the view of the valley. The devs borrowed the best feature of Heroes 4. The characters now participate in battles as units. The game's manual even invites us to play in RPG mode. This means without town management. And this is what we do in the first mission of the campaign. Captain Rosenkraytsev explores a huge map with just a handful of units as escort. The visuals have been improved, the environment is now readable, the camera seems to be closer to the ground. The game also features ship travel, underground or cavernous environments, and hero skills, as well as a lovely title theme. I'll extract this and upload it to our Patreon file server. Malgrimia is good now. Things were going well. Until they weren't. The industry was hit hard by the financial crisis of 2008, with many studios closing and projects cancelled. No financial stability, no games, says Prokofiev. The developer collective in Kharkiv was falling apart, with most individuals quitting the studio in spring 2009. Nevertheless, in July 2011, Alpha Class announced Heroes of Malgrimia 3: Elven Demons. The game was in full 3D. Screenshots showed improvements in the UI and the overall visual style, but the publisher was no longer interested. Role-playing games and strategy games were going out of favor with the publishers. The most deadly adversary, however, was the smartphone. In a social media conversation with the fans, one of the former developers insisted that the technical ideology of the game needs to be reformed, that Malgrimia 3 should be developed for the mobile market and released in parts. Even as late as 2013 or 2014, Prokofiev held hope that the development might resume, but that was not meant to be. So, in defense of Prokofievist thought, computer role-playing games and strategy games are known to be time-consuming hobbies. It can take 100 hours of exposure before you truly get a CRPG. Map painting enthusiasts often invest thousands of hours into their passion. It's a big part of life, and when confronted with this fact, it's natural for an individual to get philosophical. And sure, a training machine for the mind, that doesn't really describe what you do in these games, but perhaps it's something to be working towards. Maybe in the future it will. Perhaps this is how we create a meaning to our obsession. Personally, I enjoy the creative energy of Prokofievism. I believe what we have here is the beginnings of an East Slavic CCRU. And folks, whether you need to measure fat content in milk, train your mind with a strategy game, or uncover the mysteries of the unnerved Alpha class, we got you. Chapter 2: Master of the Broken World. A solo developer who hated college attempts to create an equal to the classics. Succeeds. As a child, Alexei Bokulev would visit his friend's house to play the latest PC games, and then at home he made tabletop versions of these games, creating paper adaptations of King's Bounty, Warlords, and even Mech Warrior. Without a computer, this was his only way of enjoying the world of PC gaming. During his school years, Bokulev learned the basics of programming. His college years were less fruitful. He was a lackluster student, frequently skipping classes and showing little interest in his studies. Alexei used college to improve his gaming skills. When the computer lab wasn't in use, he would fire up a video game. Bokulev released his first creation in 1995. Computer games. Alex Dragon. Present. And there was a terrible storm, and it was a harbinger of a new war. Ancient Battles in the Land of Sorcery. Alex Dragon Inc. Alternative title: The Ancient War of Chetrony, or AWC. This is version 1.2. There is a rumor of an even older version of the game that had a different name. For somebody's first project developed in spare time, AWC is very feature-rich. There are 3 world generation options: small islands, big islands, and a single supercontinent. And then we get to pick our lord, or lords. It's possible to designate several of them as human-controlled for the purposes of hot seat multiplayer. Dork, Master of Fire, Lord of Dragons. Belez, the Dark Sorcerer, Master of Warlocks. Gerskill, the Griffin Enchanter, King of Isinor. Some of these portraits have a lot of potential as social media avatars. Each character has a unique army, a starting spell, and the initial spell power attribute. Belez begins with the spell power of 13, while Arahar, the Swamp Overlord, starts with 4. As a copy protection mechanism, we are asked to look something up in the manual. The game won't play without it. No copy of the AWC manual survived the ravages of time. Fortunately, a cracked executable is available on a video game preservation website. Unfortunately, it seemed to make the game rather unstable. King Dork, it's your turn. Visually, AWC resembles the first Civilization game, but with even simpler graphics. Still, there is charm to it. Some squares on the world map contain objects of interest. You can spend a turn to explore these areas. Temple of Cardon. The Lord was attacked by monsters. The battle system is classic King's Bounty. We place our troops on the board and move in a turn-based fashion. Units attack and retaliate. Looks like this is the end of Dork, Master of Fire, Lord of Dragons. The war began. Great battles raged, and there were great victories, and those battles made legends. AWC never attained popularity outside of college dorms in Kiev, and it was never translated to English. Alexei wanted to make a sequel for Ancient Battles. He had a lot of ideas, but ultimately game development was a hobby. He didn't think of it as a way of making money. Well, perhaps it was the wrong mindset. After finishing college, Bokulev was looking for employment, and as luck would have it, a friend of his saw an ad for a job in GSC, a Ukrainian game development company behind the Stalker series of immersive shooters. But at the time, Stalker wasn't even in the project. The studio was making real-time strategy games, and they were looking for a game designer. So Bokulev takes a copy of AWC, a design document for the sequel, a few short stories he wrote and some of his art, and goes to the GSC office. He gets the job. Alexei stayed with the studio for 7 years, watching GSC grow from a close-knit collective of friends to a big company. After the eventual closure of the GSC strategy game division, Bokulev, now a proper industry veteran, was once again free to work on his projects. AWC TXT, January 2008 update. I am currently working on a new fantasy game. It's not going to be a sequel to AWC, 13 years have passed after all, but there will be similarities. The development of Eador began in summer 2007 and the game was released in July 2009. Bokulev barely deviated from the original concept. Eador is a universe composed of countless shards of land floating in space. Each shard is a unique world with its own geography and population. The godlike immortal beings called Masters fight with one another for control over these shards. The game blends grand strategy, province management, and tactical battles reminiscent of King's Bounty. Bokulev is responsible for almost everything in the project, with the exception of graphics, which were criticized as primitive. And while the units lack even the most basic animations, the sprite work is well done, and the battle arenas are easy to read. The world map a little less so, but it's still fine. One of the game's key features is that every province on the map is designed to be like a location in Baldur's Gate or a similar RPG, filled with encounters, trash mobs, and points of interest. A band of goblins, a crypt with undead, an adventuring party you can either parlay with or do battle. Like in Malgrimia 2 or Home 4, heroes are physically present on the battlefield. There are 4 hero classes. A warrior is an equipment-dependent martial class capable of soloing entire armies. Commander is the class that fields the most troops and offers a playstyle reminiscent of the traditional Heroes of Might and Magic games. Scout specializes in dealing damage at range, making it a good pick for beginners. A specialist mage can cast twice per round, summon demons, reanimate fallen enemies as undead servants, and even retain them after the battle. Individual units also gain experience and progress through the levels, although this doesn't necessarily make them any less disposable, and the upgrade selection is limited. Eador means world in the ancient language of the inhabitants of the shards. The choice of the name was intentional. Bokulev didn't want a long name because it would inevitably be shortened or abbreviated. Nobody says Heroes of Might and Magic. Everyone says Heroes or Hom. Nobody says the Ancient War of Chetrany. They say AWC. He wanted for his game to have a real name, not an abbreviation. The initial budget for the project was $7,000 of Bokulev's savings. By the time the development was done, he was in debt to a number of people. As one would expect, the marketing budget was non-existent. The promotion had to be done in manual mode. For that purpose, Alexei joined the forums of Absolute Games, the largest Russian-speaking gaming web zone at the time, and encouraged conversations about Eador. And this worked. The game was well received both by the critics and the masses. It got better scores than Heroes 6. The project paid for itself in half a year. When the press mistakenly identified his game as Russian, Bokulev took no offense. He was born in the Soviet Union and saw Ukrainians and Russians as one community. Eador was initially distributed as shareware. To get a full copy, you need to pay for the game on Bokulev's personal website and then email him the Eador lock file and then wait for him to send you the Eador key file, and that turns the shareware copy into a full version. The convoluted scheme created problems with individuals sending the wrong files or putting the right files in the wrong places. In 2012, the game was released in English on GOG and then eventually on Steam, and thankfully, this version of Eador is straightforward to purchase and install. And this is the Astral Campaign screen. It's where we interact with other masters and pick which shards of the torn world we are going to invade next. The game has a story, lore, and a cast of characters, some returning from Bokulev's Ancient Wars. Belaz and Gerskill make a reappearance. Dork is also back, but under a slightly different name. Now, I have never personally experienced any of this, as the Astral Campaign spans hundreds of hours. It's possibly the longest campaign in any strategy game ever. Made with Alexei's enjoyment in mind, he set out to create a game he personally would love to play. And he succeeded, and soon this would become a franchise. Eador, Masters of the Broken World, is definitely not a sequel. Bokulev calls it a remake. Same game, but with better graphics. His involvement in the development was limited, and it really shows.
The right to become the one lord of the universe and create our Eador anew.
I don't think that's how it's pronounced. Can you tell a handsome evil from an ugly good? Asks the narrator. So, is this the definitive version of Eador? The answer is nuanced. While some aspects of the game have been improved, others have taken a step back. The shift from sprites to 3D models made the shard map look cleaner, with larger hexes and less screen clutter. The Astral Campaign was made more dynamic, although it's still a lengthy 200+ hours. Perhaps the most significant enhancement is the optional DLC, which introduces much-needed variety to early game units. Good stuff so far. But then, for some reason, they replaced unit pictures with portraits. This might seem like a petty complaint, but can you tell me which one of these units is a peasant and which is a slinger? And the battles have taken a huge hit in terms of visual clarity. The particle effects and the fog make it difficult to discern what's happening on the screen. This is the most important part, and they fucked it up. Instead of pondering the strategery, I have to make a mental effort to process trivial information. Mockery. A training machine for the mind. In 2017, Snowbird Games released Eador Imperium. According to Steam charts, this is the least played Eador game, and that's no surprise. The developers added a bunch of enthusiast features to a game that was never hugely popular to begin with. There are new heroes, some of which are quite interesting. For example, a legate starts with a pair of Tier 2 units, and a pilot can fly an air balloon. The Astral Conquest mode is replaced with multiple traditional story campaigns. The visuals are still a goddamn mess, but now there is an option to turn on simplified terrain graphics. Despite not being solo projects, both the remake and the sequel were plagued by technical issues and bugs. The original Bokulev-made 2D Eador remains the most stable and the least janky. I am a game designer, not a programmer. I program out of necessity. College taught me to dislike learning. The studio behind Imperium was reportedly experiencing financial trouble after the unsuccessful launch. While all this was going on, Alexei Bokulev was returning to tradition. But not this tradition, or this tradition. No, we need to go all the way back. Tabletop games. Gremlins Inc. is a multiplayer strategy game about corrupt capitalist gremlins and their cutthroat politics. It ended up being more popular than all the Eador titles combined. Actually, it is an Eador title. The events take place inside a clockwork city. So these are the ideas of Bokulev. With Eador, we got one step closer to perfecting the machine. But that's not the whole story. Chapter 3. I Want to Believe. In 5th grade, Serhiy Grigorovich went to France on a school exchange program. He was 12 years old. In France, he bought 2 video games, and upon returning to Ukraine, he started renting them to his classmates in exchange for lunch money. This experience made him realize that there was money to be made in games. In 10th grade, Serhiy was in love with a girl, but she denied him in favor of a guy driving a Mercedes. This made Grigorovich determined to become a millionaire one day. He designed the logo for his future company back in 1993, when he was 15. GSC Game World was founded in 1995, the year Serhiy finished school. My father said that you need to put all your life, all your work into your own name, so that later you have something to be proud of. So I named the company with my initials. GSC was also his multiplayer handle. Grigorovich was into esports. Ironically, in old developer interviews, the Ukrainian participants often mispronounce the name, and instead of GSC, they say JC. So one day, when exploring the file structure of a Duke Nukem game, Serhiy noticed that the voice files were accessible in one of the folders. So, using a cheap microphone, he translated them to Russian and then sold the files for $1,200 to a major Russian pirate company, his first significant earnings. He then scaled up the operation and hired other translators. In 1996, Grigorovich employed several people in a two-room apartment. They spent $300-400 to make a translation, which they then sold for $1,500-2,000. It's how they got the initial capital for game development. But according to a different version of the story, Serhiy is nothing less than an avatar of capitalism on this earth. When he was a little kid, 7 or 8 years old, he created his own currency and used it to buy bubblegum from other children. In the early 90s, Serhiy amassed an extensive collection of video games, and then, with funds borrowed from his friend Anton Bolshakov, he acquired a batch of floppy diskettes, made pirate copies of his games, and began selling them at a flea market. Remarkably, in just one day, Serhiy earned more money than his father did in an entire month. So, by his mid-teen years, he could have probably afforded a fleet of Mercedes cars if he wanted. In 1997, the crew attempted to make their first video game. They had no idea what they were doing, and the project failed. It was an adventure game, and according to Grigorovich, they struggled to create an engaging story and compelling characters. Their first finished project was the 1998 Warcraft 2000 Nuclear Epidemic, an unauthorized sequel to Blizzard's popular real-time strategy game Warcraft 2. It replicated the core mechanics of the original even more faithfully than Prokofiev's King's Bounty 2 copied John Van Canaham's KB. But there were notable differences. In Blizzard's game, the player could select no more than 9 units at a time, with a total unit limit being just a few hundred. The GSC tech had no such limitations. It was normal to have thousands of units participating in a battle. Grigorovich seemed to dislike the idea of small armies in an RTS. He wanted the game to be about managing fronts instead of micromanaging individual units. Warcraft 2000 was never intended to be a commercial product. Serhiy thought of it as a training exercise, a training machine for the... You get it. He thought that perhaps if they create an impressive enough technological prototype, Blizzard might hire GSC to develop a real Warcraft 3. Unfortunately, the Americans never responded to his emails. The game supported higher resolutions, introduced new units and structures, and had a built-in map editor. There was no story campaign, but it doesn't mean there was no story.
Прошло еще 6.
6 years have passed. The thought of conquering humans never left the darkened minds of the orcs. A third, high-tech race has appeared. A race of aliens. They were interested in Earth's resources. Yes, according to this lore, the events of Warcraft take place on Earth. It is impressive that Grigorovich and crew managed to predict the introduction of aliens into the setting.
Инопланетяне.
The aliens have sold deadly weapons to both rival factions, knowing that the orcs and humans will kill one another. Their common, false ally was biding their time. A flying saucer teleports a nuclear missile silo to the orc camp. Things are quiet in Humanburg. Initially, the invading orcs didn't use alien technology. That's why the humans won. Enraged, the orc war chief presses the red button. In gameplay, nuclear weapons are designed to be used primarily against armies, not structures. The players can build anti-nuke defense systems in towns. The game was available for free online, but due to low internet penetration at the time, most people would obtain it by purchasing a pirate CD at a flea market. In parallel with Warcraft 2000, GSC prototyped a Doom-themed real-time strategy game called Doomcraft. The project was closed half a year later. The technology behind the unauthorized sequels was repurposed for a historical-themed RTS, Cossacks, which would eventually become GSC's first commercial product. The 1998 Russian financial crisis severely impacted Ukraine. Grigorovich lost faith in the Russian market, leading to the decision to focus on Western audience instead. In 1999, he took all 3 prototypes to the Milia trade show in Cannes. Serhiy showcased his games to some of the world's leading publishers. He recalls that the negotiations were very challenging, and I believe him. Imagine a teenager approaches you, speaking with a thick East Slavic accent, trying to sell you a fake Warcraft 3. But that little setback didn't stop Serhiy. Around this time, Alexei Bokulev arrived at the GSC offices with a design document for a sequel to the ancient wars of Chetreny. His ideas were generally accepted at GSC, but Bokulev's first actual job was making missions for Cossacks. "When are we gonna start working on my thing?" he kept asking Grigorovich. "We need to finish Cossacks first," answers Serhiy. But eventually, he surrendered. Warlocks, or Warlock, as Bokulev calls it, is a turn-based strategy game. Not a whole lot is known about Warlocks. It seems GSC changed the concept several times. Some sources describe it as a sci-fi game about an alien threat. Others speak of 12 playable fantasy races with different mechanics and victory conditions. Bokulev says Warlock was a more sophisticated version of Master of Magic, a 4X strategy game. It was to feature SimCity-like town management, and the complexity was one of the reasons the project was closed. Grigorovich blames the absence of qualified genre experts on the team. The same year, Cossacks European Wars was out in stores, bringing the company financial success and recognition. The decision was made to devote the studio's production capacity to a different strategy project and to repurpose some of the assets they made for Warlocks. Now that I am growing up, I'm beginning to approach game development more as a businessman and not as a game designer. It needs to be said that in certain ways the adult Serhiy was even less mature than his past self. I love speed. Not a day goes by without me riding my motorcycle around the city at 200 km/h. I've never been in an accident, and I hope I never will. But before Grigorovich could succeed at killing himself, he was distracted by a big release. Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos was in stores in July 2002. It was a quality production. Everybody liked it. And yet, in my opinion, we could have done better. I believe that cartoony 2D graphics are more suitable for a fantasy project than full 3D, and they introduced restrictions on the number of units. This is simply not serious. Grigorovich and the crew were working on a fantasy project of their own. Heroes of Annihilated Empires. The name was a reference to 3 contemporary strategy games: Heroes of Might and Magic, Total Annihilation, and Age of Empires. But the game they were making didn't resemble either one of them. Instead, it was a hybrid of a classic real-time strategy with base building and resource gathering, and a role-playing game with character classes, inventories, level progression. Alexei Bokulev joined the project as one of the designers. In September 2003, GSC hired a professional StarCraft player, Volodymyr Yazhov, who previously worked at an internet cafe. Like Bokulev, he also got into game design by making tabletop games as a kid. In GSC, Yazhov worked on Cossacks 2 and Heroes of Annihilated Empires, the working title eventually becoming the game's actual name. It was released in 2006.
I will cleanse this land of your filth.
There are 4 playable factions, but In the campaign, we'll be playing as elves, with our protagonist being a ranger named Elhand.
I've heard they are called vicious killers before.
Developed using Cossacks technology, which is an advanced evolution of Warcraft 2000 technology, Annihilated Empires supports massive army sizes, a feature further enhanced by the inclusion of magic spells that can destroy hundreds of enemies at once.
Mortal.
The early missions focus on hero gameplay, but base building eventually comes into play. Elven structures are tree-based. Their worker units are fairies, who can perform ranged attacks in emergencies. The Mechanicans are this game's version of the Warcraft dwarves. They are technologically advanced and field gunpowder units. You can play as the non-elven races in multiplayer and skirmish modes. Terraforming, an advertised feature, is implemented in a fairly basic way. Each race spreads its own type of creep around the buildings. The nature of the yellow substance is unknown to me. The Cryo is a frost-themed faction of warriors and sorcerers with gremlins as their workers. They produce a limited number of extremely tough but costly units, such as the Ice Golem, which gets damaged when moving through non-snowy areas, so the terraforming mechanics do have their uses. The undead buildings are summoned, not constructed, so this faction doesn't use wood. The game's genre is described as RTS versus RPG. This is not a typo. The two are in an antagonistic relationship. They're enemies. It works like this. In a skirmish or a multiplayer game, you start with a hero and nothing else. The hero has a spell that summons a bunch of workers so that you can build your base. Casting the spell puts the hero in stasis for 30 minutes, effectively removing them from the session. So you need to pick between playing with a hero or playing with a base. Why? The fictional world of the game is called Eador. GSC had previously struggled with creating engaging stories and characters, and this issue has resurfaced again. After working on the game for about a year, they conceptualized all the playable races, but there was no main narrative to tie it all together. This is how Ilya Novak, a fiction writer from Kiev, gets involved in the project. He wasn't a particularly famous or a best-selling author, but Ilya did have a handful of books published, so he knew how to put together a story. Oh, and it looks like he wrote a short book called Kabbalah. That's random. But a novel is something that you usually write by yourself. Most video games are made by many individuals, and Ilya Novak had to adjust to that. He specifically calls out Serhiy Grigorovich for heavily interfering with his proposals, even after he already accepted them. Grigorovich had a lot of going on at the time. His motorcycle team required investment of $80,000 a year, and this was just the beginning. He wanted to become the champion of Ukraine. And prior to one of the meetings, Serhiy had an accident. He broke his leg. So he arrives in the conference room in a wheelchair. The wheelchair was designed to resemble a BMW car with an electric motor and a joystick for control. During the story discussions, he would occasionally lose his temper, push the joystick, and circle the long conference table in his chair, all while sharing his thoughts with the team. Everyone else would turn their heads in unison, following the racing wheelchair with their eyes.
Mortal.
Later in Elhand's campaign, we start seeing advanced technology that seems out of place in the setting. This is never properly explained. The story ends just as it gets interesting. The game didn't sell many copies. Serhiy Grigorovich considered it to be a failed project. The GSC strategy division was disbanded. In his final few months with the company, Alexei Bokulev didn't do much of anything. There was nothing for him to do. But it felt wrong to just leave. Maybe they needed him for something. An unannounced project of some sort. Maybe? No? Eventually he did leave to begin work on Eador. Yezhov was involved in the creation of Stalker Clear Sky. He contributed to the design of Cordon and Yantar. He quit the company in December 2007. Yezhov is not in the credits for Clear Sky, so we don't know if any of his work remained in the game. Ilya Novak says that maybe 1/10 of what he wrote was actually used in Heroes of Annihilated Empires. But despite everything, he was satisfied with his his work in GSC. Novak would end up writing several tie-in novels about the world of Ecuador. A former lumberjack, now a monster slayer. A former servant of a magician, now a thief and a murderer. A dwarf saving his people from destruction. The captain of a terrifying ghost ship. A warrior from the Northern Clan. A demon dog. All of them heroes of annihilated empires.
I've heard they are called vicious killers before.
Time is a wheel. Enthusiasts from the video game preservation community oldgames.ru made attempts to contact Serhiy Prokofiev in hopes of getting the King's Bounty 2 source code. It's a piece of history, and strictly speaking, it was never finished. The final continent was never implemented. Maybe someone else can finish it. Prokofiev did respond, but he never surrendered the source code. They are not ready. Time is a fire. March 2022. The team behind Gremlins Inc. posts a message to their fans. The streets where the game was born are being shelled by Russian artillery. The artist responsible for the game's card art has traded his pencil for a rifle, joining the territorial defense. The individual who came up with the game's concept was forced into a bomb shelter. Volodymyr Yezhov volunteered into the military and took part in the Battle of Kiev. Callsign Vus was killed in Bakhmut in December 2022. As of the time of writing, the front line is perilously close to the birthplace of Slavjank. So this was part 1 of my book project, with the first 3 chapters converted to the video format. Eventually, an expanded version of this will be available in both paper form and as an ebook. On this channel, I alternate between making a weird video and a normal one. Since the last 3 videos were excessively weird, the next few will be super normal. We'll probably play Fallout London or Fallout 2 with a party. You can fund RPG Science via the crowdfunding platform Patreon, link in the description. Special thanks to our patrons, including Jim Lawrence, the hot tap of Space Noids, Yuri Solodovnichenko, a 2-room apartment in Bobruisk, Belarus. Source is the best engine ever made. Ezek Tserve, Snafu, Billy Strayhorn, Dmitry Yu, I Feed My Parrot Chicken, Azazel and Baneful the Doggo, Frog, Maciej V, 1967 Ford Mustang, Danny Kilpatrick, C6, Ganso Bomber Motherfucker, Ilya Rubin, Arkelis, Mopo, Eric Luitkehans, Celtic, Ray Ners, Tony Spagoni, Dark Butt Pumpkin. If you are European, please watch this gaming activism video by Ross. There might be some important things you can do. So, recommendations. None of the Prokofiev games are available in English, which is not that big of a loss necessarily, as frankly, they're not very fun to play. But they are interesting if you approach these games as a genre historian, as they have all sorts of exotic features like terraforming, or equipping units with different weapons, or for some reason, in Malgrimia, they decided to make castles separate from towns. TLDR, these games are interesting cultural artifacts, but I don't actually recommend playing them. With one exception, Defeat a Dragon might be worth downloading from a torrent tracker, as I don't think you can buy this. Bokulev's AWC is not quite as complex as Master of Magic, and it's not available in English anyway. On the other hand, Eador might be one of the best games of this kind ever made. Most individuals seem to prefer the remake, but I like the visual style of the original. It's up to you. Heroes of Annihilated Empires can be purchased on GOG and on Steam. The GOG version doesn't require any special trickery to make it work on modern systems, but for whatever reason, it doesn't play the post-mission videos. That might be a big deal. The game got a lukewarm reception on release, and that's for a reason. There is a lot of questionable design here. Nevertheless, RTS enthusiasts might enjoy the game. This mod, Heroes of Annihilated Empires Reborn, fixes the annoying RTS versus RPG issue and adds another playable race. There is an active community of people who still play multiplayer. That might be worth looking into. Anyways, see you in a month. Give me money.